Carl, thanks so much for coming in.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm very excited to really talk about this subject matter. Think and Grow Rich is a highly influential book, and with an incredible basis of principles to work or stem from. But I'm going to work with you to kind of talk more on that. And what's really exciting is some of the people that you've actually either worked with or had involvement with, and I'd really like to hear a few of these names, because some of these are big names as far as I'm concerned, and that's pretty impressive. But yeah, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I was first exposed to the book when I was in high school, with my hockey coach. And of course, as a high school kid, you didn't listen to anybody, so I blew it off, And so fast forward, through my college years and, early career, it was really when I was about in my late 20s, right? And I went to an event down at the Rosemont Theater where Zig Ziglar was there. The whole bunch of people, and Suzanne Sommer was there, which cool. So that was the main draw.
Zig Ziglar,
exactly. I was I'm going to go
Summer,
see
that's cool,
Suzanne
for
Sommer,
sure.
right? And Bob Proctor was there, right? And so I had no idea who Bob Proctor was, right? And so, I'm listening, and to make the long story short, but I really resonated with what Bob Proctor was talking about. So I did some research and started following him, and this is way before the internet and podcasts and all that kind of stuff. So
is this about the 90s? Or
this would have been, about 25 years ago. So, it was a while back. So, he had written a book called You Were Born Rich. That's the only book he's written, but he had 5 other programs. So again, to make a long story short, I did some preliminary, read it, didn't really study it, and it just kind of went away. Well, about 3 or 4 years later, I had an opportunity to go to an event, and again, I had been engaged at this point, and my fiance told me, she said, "Well, I signed up for a year-long program working with Bob Proctor," and I said, "Oh, that's interesting. It should be great." And at this point, we were engaged to be married, so we were, everything was coming together. And I said, "Great. When is it? What's the details and how much is it?" Well, it was very expensive, and so. It ended up being worth every penny because I got to work with Bob for a year-long period. We went away every quarter. We went to a different location. We went to Aspen, Dallas, New York, and Chicago, and then we had weekly phone calls with Bob Proctor. And for those of your listeners that don't know who Bob Proctor is, look him up. He's about 85 years old. He actually worked for Napoleon Hill and Earl Nightingale. And he is the last living link, one of the last living links to directly to Napoleon Hill, who of course wrote the iconic book Think and Grow Rich. So that's how I got into it. And during that year-long program, I really dove deep into these principles and these concepts. And out of that, I've developed my own programs, and I've led thousands of people through the programs that I've developed. But it's really great. I've also had a chance to meet people like Sharon Lechter, who was Robert Kiyosaki's partner in Rich Dad Poor Dad, Scott Schilling, a whole bunch of Don Green, who's the current CEO of the Napoleon Hill Foundation. He and I are we talk regularly. So I've been exposed to a ton of people that this has had a huge influence on.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I have never done any type of coaching or programs like that.
Yeah.
I've always been very intrigued to.
Yeah.
This day and age, we have access to a lot of content.
Sure.
I'm very aware of Bob Proctor,
Right.
and listened to many things that he's put out there and read some of his work.
Yeah.
So, but I can't even imagine doing a program like that.
Yeah, and Bob, if you ever meet Bob, ask him to show him his copy of Think and Grow Rich. He was handed to it 60 years ago. He carries it with him everywhere he goes.
The original one?
The original one, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I've read the book dozens and dozens of times. And it's interesting you say that, because Bob used to say, find a book, find a person, find a place. And that was part of his coaching to me. He said, find a book that resonates with you. He says, I don't care what it is, if it's Think and Grow Rich or the Quran or the Bible or whatever. He said, just find something that speaks to you. Find a person that has some expertise in it, and then find a place every day where you can just go and settle yourself and just be with your thoughts, right? And that was great advice, because for me, it's Think and Grow Rich. And if there's one person I can point to, it's Bob Proctor. And, I have my place I go to every day, and just, I run these principles through my mind. The other thing is there's a distinction between, reading the material, studying the material, and really being led through the material, and through somebody that has been trained to facilitate it, which I've been very fortunate, because I was trained by the master. Bob Proctor, in my mind, is the master. There's only one other person I ever met, Don Green, who is the chairman of the Napoleon Hill Foundation in Virginia. Between those two guys, there's nobody I've met, and I've met a lot of people that know this material better than as well as they know it.
So I'm glad you kind of framed it like that too, because let's maybe you could coalesce or form around it, because there's a lot of teachings out there. There's a lot of thought process behind this. And in the book, there are 16 chapters, but then you hear people talking about 13 principles. I've heard 17 principles. I've heard 5 steps to growth, 6 steps to growth. Yeah. So there's a lot of, and it's not that any of these necessarily they're wrong or anything like that, but maybe some framework around that.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because Napoleon Hill, for those of you that don't know, Napoleon Hill grew up in poverty in Virginia. He was a law student and he was a writer. This story goes, when he was a young boy, his aunt gave him a typewriter and he just fell in love with it, right? And so he was working for a magazine while he was working his way through law school, and the editor said, or I guess it would be the editor, said, I want you to write a monthly column about wealthy people, right? Well, his first interview was Andrew Carnegie, who at the time was the second wealthiest man in North America, arguably the world, behind Rockefeller. So he basically, Napoleon Hill took 20 years of his life interviewing thousands of people that were considered successful and people that were not so successful, really asking them the same questions over and over and over again. Well, at the end of that period, he wrote something called the 16 Laws of Success. It was 1,000 pages. It's very rare. You can find it some places, but I've read it, and if you've ever read Think and Grow Rich, reading the 1,000-page 16 Laws of Success is a really difficult read. His editor said no one's going to read it. So he took another 8 years. Napoleon Hill took another 8 years editing it down to about 270 pages, which is what most versions are. Sure. Now, you have to understand, there's been 47 editions since the original edition was published in 1937. And in that, he took those 16 principles and narrowed it down to 13 principles. And you're right. There are 16 chapters because there's an introduction and then there's a couple chapters on the back end. But the other chapters are the 13 principles. And you know what the funny thing about it is? A lot of people think this book is about money. Mm-hmm. And even though he mentions the word money in the book a lot, because that's something that's very tangible. You can measure it, right? You know, to the penny, you know how much money you made last year, right? However, it's really about wealth in all areas of your life. And not a single one of the titles has the word money in it. The chapters are desire, right? Faith, autosuggestion, persistence, right? The brain, the subconscious mind, the power of the mastermind, fears. The word money doesn't appear in a single one of the chapter names.
I wonder if that's the anchoring point that others will want to put around that, because that's something that we can put and people can put in their tangible minds, or kind of grasp around that idea.
Yeah. And it's really about altering or becoming aware of the way that you think. And it's interesting. In the introduction, Napoleon Hill says, I've never met a person that succeeded without using these principles, and I've never met a person that used these principles that didn't succeed, whether they were aware of them or not. In other words, these 16 principles are universal. They're timeless and they're ageless. In 2017, I took some time off. And I read about 188 books, because as I studied Think and Grow Rich for so long, there were still gaps, right? And I figured there were some gaps I wanted to fill in, right? So I started reading everything from Eastern philosophy to ancient texts to Marcus Aurelius, all kinds of stuff. And what I found was they were all talking about the same stuff. It was just Napoleon Hill at the turn of the 19th century, when the industrial age was really coming about. He just collected it all and put it into a working manual, which is really what the book is. It's if you read the book, each and every chapter has exercises. If you just do those exercises on a daily basis, you will succeed. I mean, it's inevitable, right? And I guess the point I'm making is that these principles have been around for a very, very long time, which is also why, if you talk to any guru or whatever you want to call them these days, in essence, the foundation is Think and Grow Rich, because these principles are the foundation of success.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I think that there is something along on the path too. It's almost a sense of rediscovery. There's lessons that we learn along the way,
right,
that we build on, but there's also a sense of, to your point, where these ideas, these concepts have been through, again, Marcus Aurelius, meditations, and it's some of the modern Stoicism and those concepts, that there's a simplicity to it. And that rediscovery to come back to it, and then there's the complex side of integration. And this, would you say that, can we say that this is the Lincoln Think and Grow Rich is a blueprint?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
It's a blueprint is a good way to say it. It's also a working, tactical workbook. And one of the things that I did, how I developed my program is I looked at these chapters, and for my own benefit, I started making notes and taking the chapter 1 exercise, right? Chapter 2 exercise.
Yeah.
Some chapters have more than one exercise, like the chapter on organized planning. There's 4 or 5 self-analysis tests in there. It talks about alibis, talks about leadership skills, talks about mistakes. I mean, all kinds of really great stuff. The point is, at the end of that, I found myself, I had a workbook, right? And so I shared this with a couple of people I knew, and they're like, "Oh my God, this is great." They're like,
I honestly haven't heard anybody. I haven't heard anybody. There's
a couple. But
I haven't been exposed to that.
Yeah.
And I love that.
There's a couple, but and I shouldn't say but, and I think they missed the boat a little bit. And am I biased? 100% I'm biased. But in any case, it originally came out for me doing my own work, but it is absolutely a blueprint, and it is. He gives you the roadmap right there. And remember, this wasn't Napoleon Hill's opinion. He was talking to the Fords of the world: Ford, Edison, Emerson, Kate Smith, Mary Kay. I mean, all the men and women that were successful. This is what he just took what he said. Yeah. Remember, he was a journalist. I mean, he was just interviewing them, and that's where this came about. The other thing I just want to touch on real quickly, because you did, simplicity, right? I tell people all the time, this stuff is simple. It doesn't mean it's easy. There's a distinction between the two. As a matter of fact, it's infinitely simple. It's so simple, it cannot get any simpler, right? It's as simple as it can get. It's infinitely simple. That doesn't make it easy to implement in your life, right?
Sure.
So what's the point? The point is, when you have that roadmap, or when you have those exercises that you can do on a daily basis, it starts to get easier and easier and easier, like getting over your fears, right? Eliminating negative thinking, right? This is part of what this book is all about. It's about switching your negative thoughts to positive thoughts. And how do you do that? It's very simple.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean it's always easy, right? So it's when you have these exercises and you can do them and you can catch yourself, right? I tell my kids, worry versus trust. I said, if you trust, you don't worry. If you worry, you don't trust. So when you start to worry about something, you're lacking trust, right? So they can go from worrying about something to trusting something, right? Like, for example, my daughter, she was worried about taking a test, right? I said, honey, do you trust that your teachers know what they're doing? Yes. I said, do you trust that you've studied enough? Yes. I said, do you trust in your ability to answer the question? She said, yes. I said, then what are you worried about? Right? Boom. She went right to bed.
Nice. Yeah.
Right? Instead of staying up all night worrying and having anxiety about it.
Sure.
That's so simple. But if nobody shows you how to do that, some people worry, they walk through their whole life with worry.
Yeah.
And you can't have those two things at the same time. You can't have worry and trust. Either you're worrying or you're trusting. So when you start to worry about stuff, which is the negative side of it, stop and say, okay, what am I not trusting? Right? And then you have a place to go. And that's right out of the book.
Okay. I really like that too, because there is kind of I don't want to say binary, but it is that trust and that with the trust and also i.e. faith, or is that a little bit different?
I'm glad you brought that up, because this book is laid out in a linear fashion, because that's how books are laid out. Mm-hmm. But when you've really read it and studied it and start to implement it into your life, you start to see that all these principles play together. Mm-hmm. It's not linear. And he also talks about the fact that you can't pick and choose. These principles, if you truly want to reach your top potential and succeed, you're going to make use of all these principles. And they're all interrelated. Right up around the 6th or 7th principle, which is the 7th or 8th chapter, he starts to really weave in all the other things, because he starts to talk about, he starts like the power of the mastermind, right? Like who you're associating yourself with. And how do you set up a mastermind? Well, you go back to the first chapter, which is desire. You figure out what you want, right? How are you ever going to pick the people you hang around with if you don't know what you want, right? So he starts to weave in all the different principles. And by the end of the book, you could step back and say, oh, I see how this they all work together, right? So
Right.
faith is a huge part of it, right? And he said faith is the head chemist of the mind, right? The other thing I love about the book, besides it tells great stories, it also has subtitles. So faith, the subtitle of faith is the head chemist of the mind. And he said, that's where everything happens, right? So faith, how do you develop faith, right? You go back to what you really want and why you want it. And then you start to believe in something that hasn't happened yet, right? Which is what faith is. And not from a religious standpoint, but from just from the meaning of the word. You're visualizing, right? And you're using the law of autosuggestion. You're saying, you're creating in your own mind something that hasn't manifest yet, right? And that you're really strengthening your faith. And then you go to work. It's not just about sitting around wishing,
Absolutely.
It's about action, right? And he talks about that too, having a plan,
Right.
knowing what you want, knowing why you want it, and then having faith you're going to get it, and then get into action. Because without action, nothing happens.
Okay. So, and I'd like to, it's funny because it's great. You've already articulated this, that there's a connectivity between all of these.
Yep.
I think that our brain wants to make a paint by numbers, a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step, and potentially even take it on a case by case where we're like, well, I'm going to pick number 2, 5, and 7, and somehow work on that. And, and it's human nature. I think we kind of do that stuff. But let's talk about a couple of them, because I think desire or a burning obsession with something. Yeah. And then there's a level of specificity, I don't want to say defining it, but being specific about that, and visualization. And I think that, do you feel that, or the wrong question is do you see that sometimes can we be a little bit too rigid on our visualization or the way it's perceived, where we become too rigid around the idea and too formulaic around the process? Sure. And instead of flowing and being in a state of flow, it becomes this laborious chore, and we kind of disrupt everything we're trying to kind of achieve.
Totally. And Henry Ford was accused of that, right? Henry Ford was a very strong-minded individual, right? And so a lot of people did not like to deal with him because he was just, this is the way it's going to be. He tells a story about the 8-cylinder engine being built out of a single block of steel. It had never been done before, right? Henry Ford said, I want it. And Napoleon Hill tells that story because he knew Henry Ford. Remember, they were contemporaries. He tells the story that Ford told his engineers, this is what I want, and this is when I want it, and this is why I want it, right? His engineers said, can't be done. It's never been done before. He said, well, if you want to stay working with the Henry Ford company, you better figure it out. And sure enough, within a year, they'd figured it out, right? So it transformed how engine blocks were built. But the point is, it was because he wanted it, right? And that's, and to your point, sometimes people don't understand that, and they don't understand, and it can be dysfunctional, right? And that's, I think, really what you're pointing at. When it's functional, and that goes with anything, but when you're so hell bent, pardon my French, on something, and it becomes dysfunctional, then it's an issue, right? When it's functional, then everybody's good with it, right? What's the old saying? It's right out of the book. He says, success requires no apology, and failure has no alibi, right? So when you succeed, you don't have to apologize to anybody. I mean, we see that all day long in the world, right? And so, that's part of our just the way we think. It's successful, you must be doing something right. But it can be dysfunctional, And going back to that chapter, the first chapter, Desire, it's called The Starting Point of All Achievement. There's a great exercise, and I'll be more than happy to share it with you or your listeners or whatever. It's a great exercise. Hill's got it to a 6-step exercise. I've added a couple of steps, right? So it's really an 8-step. And the first step is defining what area of your life that you want what you want, right? Because he starts with just what do you want? What's your desire? And his first step is really getting granular and saying specifically what it is you want. And for me, the step before that is which area of your life, right? So you might want something in your health,
sure,
and your wellness that's different than what you want in your relationships or different than what you want in your professional career. So the first step is really picking the area of your life, right? And then getting real granular about what it is that you want. And then the next step, which is a missing step in Napoleon Hill that I've inserted, is why. Because that's the biggest question, right? When you figure out what you want, The only way to transmute that into a desire, a burning desire, is to emotionalize it. And the only way to emotionalize it is to figure out why you want it, right? And let me just digress a little bit. You know, people talk about the word need. In my book, there's only 4 things that we need to survive, right? I call it SNOW: sleep, water, oxygen, and sleep, nourishment, oxygen, and water. That's all you need to survive. But there's a infinite number of things that you can want or desire to thrive, right? So when people tell me what they need, I said, I'm not interested in that, because there's nothing inspiring about that, right? Tell me what you want, and that's inspiring. I can help you get that, right? And the key is, how do you turn your wants into burning desires? You emotionalize them. Like, why do you want what you want in your career or with your relationship, right? And when you really ask yourself that question, why, and you get down to about that 4th or 5th why, you'll get goosebumps, and you'll actually sense like, oh my God, that's why I want that, right? And it's usually something beyond yourself. So that is the starting point. And then he goes on to say, okay, so you figure out what area, you figure out what it is specifically, you figured out why, and now the question is, and this is very key, what are you going to give in return, right? And most people interpret that as they have to give something up, but the reality is you don't have to give anything up. It's the law of reciprocity. You have to, in the law of giving, you have to give before you get, and that's where people get tripped up. You know, they're takers. No, that's not the way the universe works. You have to give, and then you get, right? So so figuring out what you're going to give in return, and you don't have to give up anything. So I apologize for going off on that particular.
I like that. No, that was great.
Well, I'm telling you, that exercise is one of the best exercises in the whole book. And if you take nothing else away from the book, really work on that exercise, and it absolutely works. And there's additional steps too that are in the book. Okay,
yeah, because I see some of these steps too, and the only reason I brought up not the only reason I brought up the rigidity is because I think that the rigidity can, or if you over-define, it's just maybe comes back to, and this is where that cycle comes back to. Maybe now you're not trusting, or you're not, or you don't understand your why.
Right.
Now, another one too is that I'd like to talk about is visualization, because I believe that thinking as if, or visualizing the feeling as if is a very powerful tool or exercise in that regard. Do you have some guidance in that arena?
And yeah, I mean, and that talks about, he talks about that in the chapter on faith, is visualization. And another one of the chapters is the chapter on imagination, right? And what did Einstein said about imagination? It's more powerful than knowledge, because knowledge is limited, imagination's not. So those two things, what you just referred to, visualization, really pulls in that principle of imagination. I mean, where do you visualize? You visualize it by closing your eyes and you imagine it, right? I mean, in the theater of your mind. So that's how those two chapters interact. But that's key. I mean, I'm sure, were you an athlete? I mean, did you play sports or whatever? I mean, athletes visualize. They talk about Michael Jordan. He would close his eyes and see the ball leaving his fingers, right? He'd see that going into the hoop, right? He'd hear the swoosh or whatever, and that had an impact on his game, right? And athletes do it, performers do it. We all do it, and we close our eyes, and your imagination is one of those mental muscles that we're all endowed with, right? And you can use that. And how do you use it? Use it through visualization, and you can project out. You and I don't know what's going to happen an hour from now, but we can project out what's going to happen, right? You may have another interview after that. You can close your eyes and imagine how it's going to go, right? It may not always go that way.
Right.
However, you have the ability to do that. And if you do that and you really, you emotionalize it, right? You get in touch with, you said it, the word feeling, right? You put that emotion to it. That's the key. We don't do anything without emotion. Human beings do nothing without emotion, right? And so when you visualize with strong emotion and you share that with other people, that brings it together, and it starts to come into form, and that's one of the big principles of this book. Really think about what you think about, use your imagination, visualize what you want, the outcome and the result that you want to produce, and then go to work on it.
That's incredible. Yeah. Neville Goddard actually has a lot of great teachings or information about using his imagination, the imagination. And I love some of his teachings as well too.
Well, it's a very powerful tool that we all have. And unfortunately, it gets shut down. As little kids, the lid gets put on it, right? I mean, our teachers, our parents, our coaches, I mean, I have examples in my life, that, when you're you see a little kid, they're just, you give them a couple blocks or whatever, and they're, we were all like that, right? With our little soldiers or, whatever it was, Lincoln Logs or, anything, and we all have that ability, and we can go back to that. And that's what that particular chapter about. It really it talks about two things. It talks about your creative imagination and your synthetic imagination, which, not to go too deep into it, but it's really good stuff.
Yeah. And I think that's some of I had mentioned almost a rediscovery of imagining that child self with that freedom of the imagination. And there's that rediscovery. But with the lessons that we learn is through the adulthood and through maybe seasons that were perceivably the hardest times in our life.
Right.
But some things are also rooted in inspiration too.
Oh, yeah.
And I would imagine you probably working with many people, you probably see both sides of that.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I just mentioned the creative imagination.
Yeah.
The creative imagination is where hunches and inspiration come, right? And that's when you really understand how to engage that and really use that muscle. That's where you start. You get connected, right? I always tell people when we get to that chapter, get in the practice of taking a piece of paper and a pen and leaving it by your bedside, because thoughts are going to come to you in the middle of the night. We've all had this experience, right? And you wake up the next day and say, what was that person's name, or that book I wanted to read? In the middle of the night, you wake up and go, oh, yeah, that's it, right? Well, write that down, because that's your subconscious mind, which, by the way, is another one of the chapters. Your subconscious mind going to work while you're asleep, right? Our subconscious minds never sleep. They're the perfect foot soldier. They're like a genie that you can give any command to. Our subconscious mind has no ability to differentiate between right or wrong, real or false, good or bad. It has no ability whatsoever. Okay. It will simply do whatever it's instructed to do by you. And if you're not giving any instructions, somebody else is. So my point is this: the imagination is rooted and connected to our subconscious mind. So when you are using these principles, right, and you're thinking about a challenge or something, and you know how to engage your creative imagination and get those inspirations, right, those ideas, where do they come from, right? They come from somewhere.
Right.
Well, when you can elevate that so that you can call on that on a regular basis, you're going to start waking up in the middle of the night with some ideas, or think of somebody that you wanted to call that you didn't think of before. It's really amazing.
Where does auto-suggestion play into the subconscious then?
That's great. That's the subtitle for that chapter is called "The Medium by Which to Influence the Subconscious Mind." Right? And it is the medium how we influence our subconscious mind. It's basically our self-talk. What do you say to yourself?
Right.
Are you a good person or a bad person? Are you too tall or too short? Did you go to the right school or not go to the right school? Right? It's all this internal dialogue, but that people don't understand that has an impact on you. Right? It has an impact because your subconscious mind is listening. I love it when people say, "I have a terrible memory." I was like, no, you don't. You have an incredible memory. Your memory is able to recall all kinds of things. If you tell yourself you have a terrible memory, your memory is going to sit there and go, "Oh, well, I guess you think I have a terrible memory." You're not going to be able to remember anything.
Yeah.
Right? So just switch that. And by the way, if any of your listeners fall into that category, I'll tell you right now how to change that. Every time you tell yourself you have a terrible memory, convince yourself you have a brilliant memory and you have a great memory. And at first you'll feel a little weird because you have probably decades of programming.
Absolutely.
Right?
Repetition.
But if you want, absolutely. That's the law of autosuggestion. Right? That's the law of autosuggestion. That is a very tangible thing I tell people all the time. Don't tell me you have a terrible memory. You have an incredible memory. But if you convince yourself you have a terrible memory, you won't be able to remember anything.
Yeah. I bet you a great add-on to that, too, that section of the book, that chapter of the book would be Joe Dispenza does a lot of neuroscience and the connection points, and observationally how the brain works with the auto-suggestions and repetition.
It's amazing. I mean, you remember this was written back in the early 1900s, right? Now they actually have scientific evidence that said we can reprogram the neural highways of our brain. And how do you do that? You do that by one synapse at a time, right? Now, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've studied some of that. It's like muscle memory, you know what I mean? If you're a skater or you throw a ball or whatever, there's neural patterns in your brain that you've created, over and over and over and over again, right? That's autosuggestion. We actually have the ability to reprogram our brains, and the neuroscientists have proven it. I mean, it's really unbelievable stuff. And Napoleon Hill was ahead of his time. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm going to circle back to a little bit of the beginning, what you were saying, because it seemed like a lot of the illustrative stories or experiences that he had with these wealthy people, and do you think this was some of the medium that he was able to truly convey this? I mean, or could he have just laid this out in a textbook format, again, paint by numbers type of scenario? Or were these examples really kind of rooted in a much more contrived or intentional way?
Yeah, I think so. When you read the 1,000 pages, it's very laborious. It's not easy to read at all, and that had so much more content. So I think he did a really good job paring it down. And one of the things I really do like about this book is he tells it through stories. He tells the stories of a guy named Barnes and a guy who was Edison's partner, and a guy named Darby, 3 Feet from Gold, and the little girl with her 50 cents. He tells all these stories. He tells the story of Pepsi-Cola, or I'm sorry, Coca-Cola. The magic kettle. He tells all these stories, and I think that was brilliant. The way he did that
probably helped really reinforce the lessons and
it's I enjoyed that, you have to remember though, beyond this, Napoleon Hill, he started with C. Clement Stone. He started Success Magazine. He had his own Napoleon Hill magazine. He wrote quite a bit more than just Think and Grow Rich. So I mean, this was his hallmark, his foundational work. But he wrote all kinds of stuff, for the next 30 years after that. And some of it was more roadmappy, if you want to say, but and again, that was one of the things when I really got into this book was I pulled those exercises out for myself because I wanted to simplify it. I read the stories, great, I get it. Now I want to put in for myself a playbook, where I can go through these exercises myself, like the 11 tenets of leadership, right? In organized planning. He tells you exactly what leaders do. And when you do these things, I've memorized them, right? Because in my life, when I, cooperation of others, right? Doing twice as much as people expect, having empathy for people, taking 100% responsibility. I mean, these are the lessons that are right in the book. And I said to myself, this makes perfect sense to me. So when you pull, you talk about that roadmap, he gives us the roadmap. If you look deep enough, it's right there.
Can you expand on, let's see, like organized planning and actually specialized knowledge? Yeah. I like the idea of the specialized knowledge, but also how that ties into the organized planning. If you can connect those a little bit, that'd be great.
Sure. I mean, so nothing happens without an organized plan backed by faith and action, right? And so part of that is you don't have to know how everything's going to work, right? And as human beings, we want to know that. And listen, I'll be the first to tell you, I used to be the kind of guy who had to know everything about everything before I did anything, right? And it stopped me. Yeah. Until I realized, no, like there's in that chapter he talks about 2 different kinds of knowledge: general knowledge and specialized knowledge, right? General knowledge is the stuff that we deal with every day in our particular society to get through the day. I'll give you an example. Some kid that grows up in Manhattan, the concrete jungle, has a different set of general knowledge than a kid that grows up in the Amazon, the rainforest, right? You take a kid from the Amazon, put him in Manhattan, it's Crocodile Dundee, vice versa, right? So the general knowledge is different based on their scenarios. Specialized knowledge is the things that we specialize in. You could be a doctor, it could be, a commercial real estate guy like you and I, right? An accountant, a lawyer, right? So that's specialized knowledge. And the key to what he talks about in this chapter is not the knowledge in and of itself is not power. It's the application and the organization of that knowledge which creates real power. And this chapter makes you aware of the fact you don't need to know how to do everything, right? You know where to find the knowledge and find the people that know how to do it. And then through the power of the mastermind, you bring them into your circle. Okay. Right? I mean, Andrew Carnegie is a perfect example. He made a fortune in the steel industry. He didn't know that much about making steel, right? What he knew how to do is he knew how to consolidate the companies and force the cost of steel so low that they were making everything out of steel. So that's where he made his fortune, right? Henry Ford said, I don't know that much about automobiles, but I have a bunch of people that do. That's the key, right? So you don't have to have the knowledge yourself. You want to know what it is you require to succeed. what knowledge base you have and what knowledge base you don't have, and then you go out and you find it, and how do you bring it into your fold? Well, the power of the mastermind is one of the ways to do that. You mastermind with people, you partner with people, and that's how he ties those two together.
I actually liked it. I'm glad you brought the mastermind too, because I was thinking about that, and there are modern day mastermind. There's mastermind groups that you can join, and some of the first steps, from what I understand, it's not so much what you're doing, it's what the omissions, what you can omit from maybe there's distractions, there's things that are deterring you from your course. And I guess that it also probably falls in lines too with limiting beliefs or understanding, seeing the ceiling or whatever that is.
Right.
But from a mastermind perspective, I believe if I'm mistaken too, is Think and Grow Rich, and then the modern day mastermind. What I'm tying together here is, I'm going to reframe that 1 second here. So off course. That's my first edit there. I love it because I had a thought train, but I wasn't quite connecting. So in Think and Grow Rich, from the mastermind perspective, who we surround ourselves with is truly integral. I think how does it translate in today's age as well too? Because I think that there are a lot of virtual mentors in that sense of things, information we can consume, and environments we can be around. And do you see a good translation or a good integration into that?
Yeah, it's interesting it comes up because really the word the mastermind. I mean, the Greeks call it forums. They've been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. Like-minded people getting together to solve a problem, right? Well, Napoleon Hill defines a mastermind as two or more people working harmoniously towards a common goal, right? Two or more people working harmoniously. That's the key word, towards a common goal. So I think people use, in the modern vernacular, people use the word mastermind all the time. And, it's a marketing tool. I'll join my mastermind. And, I don't know if they really understand the true principles of the mastermind, right? It's more than just a bunch of people getting on a Zoom call and a talking head, just telling them what to do. It's way more than that. The real essence of the mastermind is what we referred to just a moment ago. It's like figuring out who you're harmonious with, who you're synergistic with, right? You meet on a regular basis. You have common goals, right? There's a time period. You say we're going to meet for the next 6 months or a year or whatever it is, and you're all committed to all the ships in the harbor rising, right? And it's really when you do it powerfully. And I've hit part of the program with Bob Proctor, that year-long program. Every quarter, there were 22 people in that program from all over the world. It was a 6-figure program. It was very expensive. So you can imagine the type of people I was rubbing elbows with, right? And so every quarter we would change up our mastermind group so that we all got to know each other, right? And so you come to the meeting with the listening, right? You leave your ego at the door. You clear your mind, and you really listen to what the other members of the group are seeking and what they're asking the group for. And it's a really great practice because there's a huge level of vulnerability, a huge level of trust, because you're going to talk about some stuff that's really important to you, right? And you open yourself up, and then, like I said, the other members of the group really listen to how they can help you. And then each person has an opportunity to go around and say what they're after. Some weeks you may have a bigger issue that you're dealing with than other weeks. So, and not every week you're going to be able to lend a helping hand or some assistance, but that's the real essence of a mastermind. And it's evolved. I mean, it's evolved, and it's a buzzword. I think a lot of people say,
it makes sense.
And there are some out there that are done right. Now, Bob Proctor, Mark Victor Hansen, Jack Canfield. Chicken Soup came out of a mastermind that Proctor was in with Mark Victor Hansen, Jack Canfield. I forget, there were 2 or 3 other people, and that whole thing came out of a mastermind with those guys.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a lot of people don't know that, but because they don't publicize it. But I mean, that's the type of powerful thing that can come out of that. And it's when it's done correctly. And don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with other people getting together, but the true essence of the mastermind is described in the book.
Sure. It's kind of the one person has an idea, another person has the idea, that together they have a third idea, and
you create a third mastermind.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's uses the analogy of batteries. When you wire batteries together, they're more powerful than they are on their own.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's a great chapter, and there's a great story. He talks about the Declaration of Independence and how those 53 men, or was it 56 men? I can't remember the number, but how they literally created a mastermind that changed the world. Every democratic revolution in society since then is based on the American Declaration of Independence, and those people literally wrote their own death sentence. If they did not succeed, they would have hung from the gallows. And he illustrates that not all of our decisions are life and death.
Mm-hmm.
But he goes to that extent to illustrate that is the power. You can literally change the world just by being part of a mastermind.
It's the burning of the ships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. No retreat.
No retreat. Yeah.
We've all been there.
Yes. 1 second here. So we're doing good on time. So it's 5:00 right now.
Sure,
but
perfect.
We're okay. What I was thinking too is, because I'm just going to raise my hand, because then I know that I'm going to kind of edit this out, and it's just a thought. So, because for the end, we're just how can people get a hold of it? That's really quick. And you've really integrated already. You've really kind of answered, how do you work with people? I think so. There was only really one other thing on my list that I was going to, like I mentioned too, like the principles that how it would translate into, for example, if somebody was going after a new job or starting a new business, and maybe some incremental, thought-provoking and something like that. So, so it would probably be more of an integration and from a practice. So why don't we just kind of talk a little bit about that, and
I'm going to talk about the fear, doubt, and confusion. I think that fits in perfect.
That would be that's perfect. So I'll just kind of tee that up.
Yeah, the epilogue is that last chapter.
Okay, yeah, I'll just kind of clamor on for a second there, and then and then we'll kind of go from there and just expand as long as you want on it and stuff. So. What was the last one we talked about there? That was because we ended at...
you were talking about the power of the mastermind?
Yeah, we were talking about the mastermind. Okay, perfect.
Specialized knowledge and mastermind, how they integrate.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to go over every single chapter, but I think we're really touching a lot of, so maybe that's the next...
I could talk about it for hours.
Yeah. So, okay, let me think for a second. But yeah, that's really fascinating about the mastermind. And... understandably, that there obviously any term or keyword can be converted into a program per se, but thanks for kind of elaborating on the aspect of the Think and Grow Rich. And there's another really kind of a mindset I'd have for my listeners here. So from an integration standpoint,
right?
And whether we go into all three of these or just one of them, but if somebody's seeking a new job, for example, or they're starting a new business, or maybe it's a side hustle, or even even as simple as going to a networking event or deciding that I'm going to start networking more. It's there's a first step. There's an actionable step. You get inspiration on something. I'm going to start this business, or you're like, I'm not happy where I'm at right now in my job. It's just sucking the life out of me. So, from a starting point or a launching point, there's obviously identifiers, and that would come back to some of the earlier points that you had talked about with fear, and I would love for you to kind of go into that more.
Sure.
But from an integration standpoint or an initial step, is there somewhere somebody should start, or feel free to take it from there.
Yeah. Well, I always tell people start at the beginning, go the desire, really going through that desire, figuring out what area of your life, what you want, why you want it, what you're going to give in return. That's the starting point, right? And then the other thing to get beyond, and this is in the last chapter, depending which edition is called the epilogue, or the 6 ghosts of fear, right? And there's getting beyond your fear, your doubts, your indecision, and your confusion, right? Because what really made sense for me was I looked at my life. Where was I stopped in my life, right? And whether it was my hockey career or my professional career or with relationships, whatever, what I figured out was it was fear, doubt, and confusion was coming into play, right? And when you start to really understand, there's really only 6 human fears, right? There's only 6 human fears, and I've memorized them 3 and 3, right? The first one is fear of criticism or judgment. Fear of poverty or success, right? Some people are afraid of success, right? Fear of loss of love or affinity towards others,
Sure.
right? And then the other 3 are fear of illness, fear of death, and fear of old age, right? So,
okay, so physical, you kind of broke them into like a physical into a or mindset or
more of a social,
mental. Okay.
Right. And here's the kicker. Most people aren't aware of that. Now, any fear that you can name, and I've interviewed lots of people, falls in one of those 6 buckets. I remember years ago I worked with a woman, she was afraid of spiders. She literally, if she saw a spider in the room, she'd run out the room, right? 3 weeks later, I had her holding a spider in her hand, right? Why? Because I really got to the root with her. She wasn't afraid of the spider. She was afraid of getting bitten by the spider, which is the fear of ill health or the fear of death. Because when she was a little girl, she got bit by a spider and she broke out, right? So she went from not being able to be in a room to totally managing that fear. Didn't mean the fear went away. She just knew how to manage it, right? Well, how does that translate into our day-to-day life? Well, someone may be afraid to, at a networking event, they may be afraid to go to the networking event, or once they're there, they may be afraid to go up to people they've never met before and put themselves out there and introduce themselves, right? And which fear does that fall into? Obviously not fear of death,
right.
Fear of old age, fear of illness, right? It's the fear of criticism or fear of judgment, right? And it's all a state of mind. Fear, doubt, confusion, indecision are all states of mind. We're afraid of things that haven't happened yet, right? And so when you understand that and you become aware of that, then you can start to control it and you can start to direct it. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to that fear goes away. Listen, Tom Hanks, I read his autobiography. He said, or his biography, he said, I still get afraid. I mean, the guy's done everything. He says, I still get jitters when I go up there. So that fear is always there. It's just a matter of being aware of it and taking control and directing it. So that's just, and that goes for, starting a new business. It goes for asking for a promotion. Asking for a raise or just a comparable level of pay for your coworkers. I mean, that's a big issue these days. A lot of people aren't getting paid what they should be getting paid because they're afraid to ask or they're afraid to, it's fear, right?
It's fear. Maybe they fear that they're going to lose their job because they asked or
they're going to look greedy.
Yeah, they look greedy
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and then the other 2 things are doubt and confusion. Here's the thing I have to say about doubt. If somebody else has done what you want to do, whether it's starting a business or networking or getting a promotion, asking for any category, if somebody else on earth has done what you can do, then you're able to do it as well. Because I believe it's less to do with ability and more to do with willingness, right?
Right.
Earl Nightingale, I'm a huge fan of Earl Nightingale too, The Strangest Secret.
Yes.
He says that one of the keys to success is successful people are willing to do what less successful people are not willing to do. Doesn't mean they enjoy it, but they're willing to do it, right? So if somebody has done something that you want to do, that means that you're able to do, I believe you're able to do it as well, right? The question is, are you willing? And so that's how you manage that doubt thing, right? If you doubt yourself, think about, it's just a matter of willingness, right? Are you willing to put yourself out there?
Yeah.
And then confusion, right? The thing about confusion is people just don't know how to do it. So they stop themselves dead in the tracks. How do you get beyond that? Go back to your why. If your why is big enough, the how doesn't matter, right? If the why is big enough. And even something like networking, if you've decided and made a decision, right, that you're going to go to networking events because you want to expand your circles or you want to meet more people or whatever reason, when you keep that desire in front of you, then you don't care about how you're going to do it. You just continue. You do it because your why is big enough.
Yeah.
Right. And you get beyond that stuff. So again, that last chapter is huge. He talks about fear, doubt, indecision, and confusion. And he talks about how you can really get out of your own way.
That's amazing.
Another analogy I use, we were all kids, right? First time you're on a high dive, right?
Yeah.
You're scared.
Yeah, it's scary, yeah.
Scared.
For sure.
Right? Well, it's no different. right? What's going through your mind? You couldn't articulate this, that you're afraid of hitting the water, or you're afraid of getting injured, or whatever, right? No. You're afraid of being embarrassed because all your buddies or the cute girl or whatever is watching you, and you don't want to make a big you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, but then what happens? You finally get beyond that for whatever reason, right? Because the fear of embarrassment and versus the fear of just getting it over with outweighs it, right?
Yeah.
Right? And you jump in, you don't get hurt, you don't drown, and next thing you know, you can't wait to get back.
I see it all the time with my two young boys. They'll do something, they'll be apprehensive, and then we're just going to do it 20, 30 times. It's not even
we're no different.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and I use that analogy because a lot of people can relate to that.
Yeah.
You're not going to, it's fear that stops you.
It's amazing. There's actually, Tony Robbins talks about, or explains, he had interviewed a woman, she was talking about how she felt when she was afraid. She's like, I get these butterflies, I get this feeling, and
sorry, we had a stutter in the computer, so we lost the last couple of minutes.
Oh, no, that's okay, man. All right, no worries.
So if you want to redo also.
It's okay. It's all right. We can wrap it up. You got
no, I mean we still, like we said, we don't. The next session is not gonna come up till 6 o'clock.
Okay.
But
did you start? Where did you lose?
I started again. We lost the last 2 minutes of whatever you were talking about, or a minute and a half. That's it. So whatever.
Okay, I think we were okay because I think we were kind of going on about fear, and I'll just kind of restart. So we're restarted now.
Yeah,
we're good?
we restarted.
Okay. Cool. So.
Why are we talking about the diving board?
Yeah, we might have lost that. It's okay. So we were talking about fear. Is Tony Robbins tells this story about he was interviewing a woman about fear, and she was explaining how she felt. That it was this feeling in her shoulders. I don't remember exactly how he explained it. And a tingle, and a feeling in her stomach, and she just gets so upset. And then he was also interviewing, I believe it was Bruce Springsteen, about going on stage before a show, and he's like, "Can you explain it to me? How do you feel?" And he's like, "Well, I get this feeling in my shoulders, and I get this feeling in my stomach," and he realized they were describing the exact same thing, but he used his fear for excitement. He converted that into, I'm not fearful, I'm actually excited. I'm inspired to do this.
Right.
And that's actually been helpful in some aspects of my life. I've been able to convert some of these. I'm like, well, maybe I'm not actually nervous. Maybe I'm just excited.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm fooling myself, but that's okay. Yeah. I'm excited.
Well, that goes back to what I talked about earlier, function or dysfunctional, right?
Yeah.
So that can be a motivating thing, or it can be a debilitating thing, right?
Yeah.
And so, I always go back to, I talk a lot about Bob Proctor because, he used to say, listen, if you are not excited and a little bit afraid of whatever endeavor you're embarking on, it's not a big enough endeavor. He said, when it's big enough, you're going to be apprehensive and a little bit afraid, but you're also going to be very inspired and very excited about it, right? So, it's really using that energy and that mindset, because again, fear is a mindset. It's a mindset, right? And so you can either manipulate that mindset to your advantage, or it can really shut you down, And so understanding that is key, because it's all in our minds. Fear it's a state of mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the beautiful thing about that is you have complete and total control over it. Listen, I can influence your mind. I can't control your mind. Right. Likewise, right? And so the only thing, and I'm convinced of this, the only thing that I have absolute control over in this entire universe is my own thoughts, my mind. Right. Right? And I believe everybody has that too. I mean, Mandela is I love Mandela. I mean, they locked him in a cell for 25 years. It's 1/10 the size of this room. Right. 25 years. And he came out, he didn't have, he said they could take everything away from me, but they could not control my thoughts. And that's so powerful, because fear is nothing more than a state of mind.
That's some of the teaching, like Viktor Frankl.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my God. Great book.
Yeah.
One of my favorites.
Yeah. And
Man's Search for Meaning is.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. That's phenomenal. So I know that we could probably expand on that too, but I'm gonna pause here for a sec. I was gonna say I'm just gonna add something about my channel, which won't end up on yours, but I'll might be something I use later or something like that. But I know that, so with this, even with this channel, that I've actually I've had the fears and the doubts, but it's wild, because I've converted into turning into an excitement level, or anchoring on whys. I'm sure if I, as I dig down, there's a specific why, but I actually have a number of whys.
Sure.
And I found that was helpful for me too with this, because if one of the whys feels a little shaky, I can jump onto the other ones. I'm like, I'm okay there, like that's all right. Maybe I'm not sure, but I'm sure that's okay. And
sure.
But I'm able to pull out a number of different whys
Sure.
to reinforce what I'm doing and launching the channel and even committing to it,
Right.
Setting out and saying that I'm just going to commit to having 50 people on the show no matter what, and even if I bomb the first 25, it doesn't matter. I'm going to commit to doing 50 because I know that there's going to be gold for there. But then committing to doing and preparing for the guest, being the best I can for that guest.
Yeah.
Not necessarily myself, but doing what you said in the lesson before is about, what can you give? And if I can provide them with a good experience and some content, I know that there's a success in
Sure,
that.
that's huge. Well, a couple comments if I can.
Yes.
There's nothing wrong with having more than one why, right? Because like I said, I always tell people right from the get-go, break up your life into 5 different areas, right? Your relationships, your health and your wellness, your health being your body, your wellness being your mind, your education, your profession, your resources. A lot of people call that money, but it goes way beyond just your money, right? You have social resources, you have intellectual resources, you have physical resources, financial resources, and then your spirit, whatever that means to you, right? So you can have a different why in each one of those. And some of those whys...
No, that's a great point. Yeah.
Some of those whys can roll up into the same, right? I mean, there may be some, in your example, there may be some, you might network with people so that there's some financial why in there for you, right? It might be because you enjoy developing relationships, right? You develop a relationship when you have a guest, right? So you could have multiple whys, that are all moving you in the same direction, and oftentimes we do.
Yes.
And then the other thing that we didn't really talk about, but Napoleon Hill does talk about it, is temporary failure, right? Temporary failure. Failure is the first step to success. If you're not willing to fail the first 10 episodes of your podcast, you'll never succeed in your 50th.
Yeah,
right? Because you'll decide to quit. There's a distinction between quitting and being defeated and temporary failure. Failure is the first step to success. Defeat is when you decide to quit.
Okay.
You decide to quit. And again, that is a huge distinction, right?
Yeah.
Most people, first sign of adversity or first sign of I told you so, or first sign of, well, what makes you think you can do a podcast?
Right.
First sign of that, they give up.
Right.
Right.
And I think some overcoming of that for me was decisive action. Just do it.
You hit it right on the head.
Yeah.
Making a decision based on your desire and taking action.
Yeah. And in this, I'm sorry, I was going to say, in this example was I actually had quite a few hurdles. I had to go through different studios and I couldn't find where to do. And you really, when you have a passion project or you feel inspired and you have, it is amazing what you're capable of doing.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
And listen, one of these podcasts is going to, if not more, you never know who's listening. It could change someone's life.
Right.
Right? I mean, that's the way I look at it. My brother was a teacher. I'll never forget this. I'm from Cleveland, and we were driving. I was home. I was living in San Francisco, whatever. We were home, and we're driving along, and some kid, some young guy. My brother and I were probably 30 years old, right? And some young guy, I thought he was giving us a hard time, right? Well, he recognized my brother as his teacher, right? And he came over to the thing, and I'm thinking, why is this guy coming to our window? We were sitting in the car at a stop sign, and he leans in and he goes, "Mr. Moose, is that he goes, it's so and so," and my brother goes, "Oh, hey, how are you?" Right? I felt like a complete jerk because I'm judging this person and thinking he's gonna right. And my brother picked up on it, and he said, "You're a real jerk." I said, "Thanks." And he said to me, Carl," he said, you may earn more money than I do." He said, "But you know what? When I make the difference in one person's life every year, it's been a successful teaching year."
Yeah.
Right? And I said, "Well, you make more than a difference in one." He says, "I know." I said, "But that kid," and this kid said, "Oh, if it wasn't for your counseling, I wouldn't have gone to college. I got a scholarship, and he's doing right." And
that's amazing. Yeah.
What's my point? My point is that one podcast can literally change someone's life.
Yeah.
And when I'm getting goosebumps right now, but when you think about it from that perspective, it's beyond you.
Right.
It's bigger than you. So you'll get over your fears because you go, you know what? This next podcast could be the one that makes a huge difference for people.
And calling back to Think and Grow Rich, I believe that sometimes there are callings that we get pulled towards.
Oh yeah.
And having these reinforceable steps that we go through, we're able to get in those states of flow better. So it's sometimes it's even preparing for those. So there's lessons that we come across that maybe we don't recognize along the way.
Yeah.
And things start to come in place, and maybe that's some of the hindsight. And you look back and you're like, okay.
Oh, for sure.
I see that now. I see this, where this went. That's really amazing. That's really beautiful.
And I'm Steve Jobs. That book. I don't know if you read it yet. Jobs.
I haven't.
Oh, you got to read it.
Yeah, it's
one of the things I'm probably going to screw up this quote, but he says, looking forward, the dots never connect. Mm-hmm. But looking back, they always do, right? So when we're looking forward and we're taking that next step, we don't always know where it's going to lead us, right? But he said when you get there and you look back, you go, oh, that's why that happened. And that's why I took that step. And that's why, you know what I mean? So to your point, yeah, absolutely. In the moment, you may not realize, but when you have faith, right? When you're persistent, when your decisions are backed by your desire, right? You bring all these things, you keep telling yourself, this is why I'm doing this. It's this is what I'm, you know what I mean? All those things you look back and you go, oh, okay, it makes sense, right? And that's the beautiful thing about this book. I mean, he really weaves this stuff in. And when you some people read the book and they'll say, oh yeah, I read that, right? Yeah. Some people study it and they remember some but forget most. But when you really abide by it, when you really bring these principles into your life, it transforms. I know that's an overused word, but it really it elevates you to a different level. And it's just not me talking about that. There's millions of people that have been affected by this book and studying this book.
Absolutely.
And by the way, this is not the only book. Remember I said earlier, Bob Proctor says, well, it may not be Think and Grow Rich for you, right? It just happens to be the book that speaks to me. It speaks to a lot of other people, but it's not the end-all, be-all. It's just, for me, it's the concise roadmap that Napoleon Hill put together almost 100 years ago, and here we are still talking about it.
That's outstanding.
Isn't it crazy?
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
It's really cool.
So if somebody wants to work with you or learn a bit more about it, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, probably just shoot me an email. That's probably the best way. info@yourfocusguy.com. That's the name of
okay.
Yeah, the name of my program is Find Your Focus. It's all based on the 13 principles of success, and it's broken up into three groups: finding your focus, maintaining your focus, and then sustaining it long term. And each of those three areas use different principles from Think and Grow Rich to find your focus, different principles to maintain it, and different principles to sustain it. So I'm your focus guy, right? That's how I brand myself. And if you want to find out information, or if anybody emails me about this particular program, I'll send them a few of the things that we talked about, because I've got it all. I got so much content over the last 25 years, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But yeah, just info@yourfocusguy.com.
Perfect. And we'll have that in the description.
Yeah.
So perfect. Thanks again for coming in.
I really enjoyed this. I told you
Absolutely.
I could talk for hours on this stuff, and I love the fact that you we just met less than a month ago. And
at a networking event.
And here we are. Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And here we are talking about stuff that we're both passionate about.
Yeah.
So thank you for doing this.
Absolutely. Thanks. All right, guys, we're good. Oh man.